The sun was barely rising over the glassy surface of the lake when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A sound I knew didn't belong because I hadn't invited anyone and nobody came this far down the private access trail without either a reason or a warning. And sure enough, when I stepped out onto the deck of my lakeside cabin with a mug of black coffee in hand, I saw her Karen standing there at the edge of my driveway, arms crossed like she was about to deliver divine judgment. Her HOA badge hanging around her neck like she thought it had actual legal weight. And before I could even say good morning, she started barking orders. "You're trespassing on HOA property. You've been given 3 notices. Leave immediately or I'm calling the police." And I nearly choked on my coffee. Because I'd heard of HOA power trips before, but never had one march down a private shoreline to try and kick a man out of the cabin he built himself, on land he owned outright, with title, deed, mineral rights. And even the original land patent signed a century ago by the state. And when I calmly told her she was mistaken, that this land wasn't just mine, but lay well outside the HOA's jurisdiction, she smirked and waved a folded piece of paper in my face like it meant anything to me, declaring it was newly annexed into HOA governance under Emergency Ordinance 5B, a joke of a rule that was likely made up that morning on printer paper in the boardroom of a clubhouse I never voted for, never approved, and never recognized. And I told her to take her paper and her threat and march them back up the hill to her little vinyl palace. But she didn't. She pulled out her phone, dialed 911 right in front of me, and told the dispatcher there was a squatter on HOA-controlled lakefront property refusing to leave, and I just stood there, sipping my coffee while the wind blew gently through the pines, knowing full well this show she was putting on would collapse faster than her fake bylaws, because while she called the cops and paced like she was preparing for battle, I walked back inside, grabbed my land file, the thick folder that held every legal document I needed, and waited on the porch as the sheriff's SUV pulled up 10 minutes later, lights flashing, more for show than necessity, and 2 deputies stepped out, hands on their belts. And Karen ran to them like a toddler reporting a broken toy, breathless and pointing, ranting about how I was violating HOA space, that I refused to comply with an eviction, that I threatened her, which, of course, I hadn't. But none of it mattered the moment I handed my file to the lead deputy who opened it, flipped through 3 pages, saw the gold seal of the county recorder's office and the accompanying federal land survey certificate, and looked up at me with an eyebrow raised before turning to Karen and asking, "Ma'am, are you aware this parcel is under independent governance and not within your HOA chartered boundaries?" And the colour drained from her face right there in real time. And I didn't stop there.
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.
Her face right there in real time. And I didn't stop there. I pulled out my second trained card. The one most people never expect. The one that shuts everything down with one sentence. And I said, "This entire lake and the land surrounding it falls under my jurisdiction, because I don't just own this cabin, I own the unincorporated holding company that manages 97% of the land in this county." And Karen laughed at first until the deputy confirmed it on his onboard laptop, pulling up the registered land map, color-coded, and saw my name attached to not just one lot but hundreds, a web of parcels held under a trust name that traced directly to my ownership. And when he asked, "You're the county landowner of record?" And I nodded, Karen's face turned from smug to scared, and she began stammering about HOA rights and resident protection and community integrity, and that's when I dropped the final blow I pulled out the signed letter from the county commissioner's office granting me exemption from HLA enforcement due to my municipal utility contributions, and the deputy simply handed her paper back and said, "Ma'am, you've got no authority here. If you persist, we'll have to charge you with harassment and trespassing." And Karen looked like someone had just unplugged her world. Standing there speechless as I walked back onto my deck, waved politely, and took another long sip of coffee. What Karen didn't understand What she couldn't possibly comprehend in that moment of arrogance standing on my gravel path with a 911 operator still buzzing in her ear was that she'd just lodged a war with a man who'd been building his prash defense for years, not just legally, not just politically, but structurally, historically, and geographically, because my roots didn't stop at this cabin. They stretched into the very soil of the county she thought she ran. Going back 3 generations to when my grandfather was the only surveyor for 5 surrounding townships, back when the county wasn't even fully incorporated, when land deeds were recorded by hand in ledgers, signed with wax. And that knowledge, that intimate relationship with every border, bluff, and basin, had passed to me like a secret weapon disguised as legacy. And I didn't just inherit land, I inherited leverage. And over the years, while HOA boards like hers spread like mold in planned developments, I stayed out here, quietly acquiring the forgotten parcels, the bankrupt timber lots, the mining land abandoned after a failed permit, renewal, the shoreline that developers skipped because of rock formations or shallow water access, and I stitched it together like a quilt until the map didn't show scattered dots, it showed a kingdom, and I made sure every document was bulletproof, every easement clarified, every zoning exception preserved under county grandfather causes so old they were typed on carbon paper. And so when Karen called the police, when she brandished her HOA fine, notices like they carried real weight. She was stepping into a battlefield where the terrain was mine and she had no compass, and when the sheriff's deputy confirmed it, when he looked her in the eye and said, "Ma'am, this cabin is outside your jurisdiction entirely," she didn't retreat. She doubled down, like all good tyrants do when they're faced with a truth too big to swallow. And I watched it happen over the next 48 hours. Her marching back up to her HOA board, whipping them into a frenzy, spinning stories about a squatter defying community values, about a loophole land baron trying to undermine their authority, and she held an emergency board meeting where she pushed through an emergency annexation policy, completely illegal, unsigned by any county office, and the next morning I woke up to find HOA security guardsmen with matching shirts, radios, and clipboards standing at the edge of my property line, claiming they were there to monitor the situation, and I laughed, because that's when I knew she was fully unhinged, playing make-believe border patrol.
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
Because that's when I knew she was fully unhinged, playing make-believe border patrol on land she prayed, didn't even own, and I greeted them the same way I greet everyone calmly, legally, and with a copy of my boundary plat. And when they refused to leave, I called the actual sheriff. Not a 911 dispatcher, but the elected official himself, Sheriff Davis. A man I'd known since high school. A man who used to fish with my uncle at the same dock, Karen now claimed was HOA property. And when he showed up 30 minutes later, he didn't knock, he waved, shook my hand, and escorted those so-called guards off the land, with a warning that if they crossed the boundary again, they'd be charged with impersonating law enforcement under state statute 19(6). And that was strike 2 for Karen, because now she wasn't just trespassing, she was deploying unauthorized private security against a landholder with documented political ties, and I hadn't even played my top PAMA card yet. The fact that I sat on the County Land Advisory Board, a seat I earned not through politics, but through sheer contribution, by donating access roads, restoring watershed protections, and maintaining shoreline cleanups that Karen's HOA never lifted a finger for. And when I brought that up in an open meeting, during a county session televised on public access, I used her full name, referenced her board's attempt to illegally expand their governance into private territory, and I did it while holding a printed email where she bragged to another HOA president about claiming Lakeland by force of presence, and the room went quiet, dead quiet, Bick. Officials don't like lawsuits. And what Karen had done was walk herself into the crosshairs of at least 3. Mine, one from the sheriff's office for misuse of emergency services, and a third from the Department of Land Trusts, because her annexation included a sliver of shoreline designated as a protected bird habitat. And the moment I filed a complaint, that department sent out a federal conservation officer who cited her board $10,000 for violations of the migratory species buffer zone, and I smiled when I watched the notice get crashing. Pinned to the HOA clubhouse door, because no, this wasn't just about a personal feud, it was about reckless governance. And that's when the cracks began to show, not just in her board, but in her public image. Because residents started asking questions. Why are we fighting with the landowner who maintains the entire watershed? Why are we getting fined? Why did the sheriff pull HOA security out of the neighborhood? And slowly the tide turned, not all at once, but visibly, with people skipping meetings, siding, eyeing Karen as she passed by. One guy even pulling up next to me at the gas station and whispering, "For what it's worth, man, I'm on your side." And I knew then that her time was running out. But I didn't stop. There I escalated, filing for a temporary injunction blocking any HOA action related to my land, including the placement of surveillance, fines, or boundary encroachments, and the judge granted it without question, stating in his remarks that the respondent appears to have acted beyond any reasonable interpretation of chartered HOA authority, and that ruling hit her like a freight train because it meant everything she had done was now on record as unauthorized. And her board members, once loyal, started resigning one by one, citing personal conflicts, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she cracked completely, but she still had one play left the media, and quote, "That's when she did the unthinkable." She contacted a local news outlet, tried to spin the whole story, painted herself as the defender of the lake, claiming she stood up to illegal cabbing squatters, but she made one mistake. She used my full name in the broadcast, and when the clip aired, it triggered every legal firewall I had. Defamation, false statements, public slander against a registered land conservator, and the legal notices hit her inbox within 12 hours, and this time, even the HOA's insurance company backed away, refusing to cover her defense because her statements were willfully false and not approved by board consensus, and she was left standing alone, surrounded by lawsuits, federal citations, sheriff warnings, and a neighborhood that had finally seen her for what she was, a dictator in a sundress pretending to run an empire. And as I stood on the deck of my cabin one last time that season, watching a bald eagle glide over the lake, once claimed as hers, I took a deep breath of clean mountain air and said out loud, "You should have read the deed, Karen." And I meant every word. You'd think after the injunction, the conservation fines, the sheriff's office warnings, and a public humiliation on local television that Karen would have finally backed down, retreated, maybe even issued an apology and quietly vanished into whatever vinyl-sided cul-de-sac she called home. But people like her don't go quietly, especially not when they've tasted the kind of petty power that comes from running a neighborhood like a private kingdom. And when cornered, they lash out not with logic, not with facts, but with desperation. And that's exactly what she did when she filed a fraudulent emergency petition with the State Planning Board, claiming I was improperly controlling unincorporated land, suggesting I had circumvented zoning laws through hidden trusts, and the moment I saw the notice come through, hand-delivered by a red-faced courier who apologized before he even handed me the envelope, I knew she had pulled strings, likely used some distant political contact who owed her husband a favor. Someone who pushed the petition through back channels in hopes of fast-tracking it before anyone noticed. But what Karen didn't count on was that I sit on the oversight subcommittee that reviews land integrity cases for the big state. And not only did I recognize the petition format, I knew the case reviewer personally, Margot Dean, a retired judge who owed me dinner from the time I helped save her family's Lakeside parcel from highway redistricting, and when I called her and explained what was happening, she nearly choked on her coffee laughing, then promised she'd handle it, and within 48 hours, the petition was not only rejected, but publicly flagged as bad faith legal abuse, and Karen's name was formally submitted to the state's Civic Ethics Review Board, triggering a secondary investigation into her history of HOA enforcement abuse, which, thanks to a thick folder I'd already made.
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
HOA enforcement abuse, which, thanks to a thick folder I'd already mailed them, was stacked with enough violations, backdated policies, and forged board signatures to light up a courtroom like the 4th of July. And if that wasn't enough, I dropped the final card I'd been holding. A copy of the land tax ledger showing that her own property Karen's precious Lakeside home was built on a narrow buffer zone that was, due to a decades-old misfiling, technically still registered to the county utility district, which meant her ownership was voidable unless back taxes were cleared and the deed corrected. And when I submitted that report, the assessor's office, a quiet investigation began, and 2 weeks later she received the notice. Her home's ownership was now under audit, her deed temporarily frozen, and she had 30 days to provide a paper trail that had never existed. And while she panicked, while she called lawyers and accountants and probably cried in her marble kitchen, I stayed quiet because the final move wasn't public. It was personal, and it came the night of the emergency town meeting, where she tried to rally the last few loyal board members for restoration vote, hoping to re-establish HOA enforcement power in select zones. And that's when I stood up, in front of a room full of residents, media, and state oversight reps, and said, I hereby submit a motion for community independence, backed by unanimous petition signatures from 91% of property holders, to dissolve all HOA governance within the affected CRU territory. And, as I passed the papers to the moderator, Karen looked at me like she'd seen a ghost, and the crowd erupted not in anger, but in relief, in applause, in laughter even, because the rain was over, and that night, the vote passed unanimously, and the HOA was officially dissolved, its accounts frozen, its clubhouse shuttered, and its signs pulled down one by one, and when Karen tried to object, her mic was cut off, and she was escorted from the podium by 2 deputies under direct order from the state monitor assigned to ensure compliance with the dissolution protocol. And that's when she screamed loud, dramatic, "Full of rage, you can't do this!" And I looked her square in the eye and said, "Karen, I already did." And with that, I walked out into the night, where news crews were already broadcasting the collapse of what they called the most aggressive HOA in the Tri-County area, and the next morning, the headlines told the story for me. Lakeside community freed from HOA tyranny. County landowner outmaneuvers rogue board, and the fallout was, Swift Karen was banned from forming or joining any civic board in the state. Her house was seized for tax correction proceedings, and she filed for relocation within 30 days, disappearing from public life entirely, while I took the land she once claimed to control and opened it for free. Public access with new boat ramps, hiking trails, and a community pavilion paid for entirely out of the HOA's former operating fund, now transferred into a trust for land restoration and access equity. And as I stood under the pavilion, roof weeks later, watching kids skip stones across the lake and fishermen cast their lines in peace, I leaned against the post and let the quiet settle over everything, knowing that no HOA would ever touch this place again. Because I didn't just fight, Bakai rewrote the rules, and sometimes the only way to win against tyranny is to own the ground they stand on and pull it out from under them.